So we're here today on this podcast talking about Bhagavad Gita as it is by Srila Prabhupada. And we are honored to have as our guest speaker today, Yogeshvara Das, also known as Joshua Green. And a little introduction about Yogeshwar. He has a very accomplished life, both in devotional service and in his material world. He's a very successful person. Originally, Yogeshwar was initiated by Prabhupada in 1970 in London, where he recorded with the London Temple on George Harrison's Radha Krishna Temple album. Yogeshwar received Brahminical initiation in 1972, and during 13 years of temple life, he served as temple president in Paris and later in Philadelphia, head of ISKCON's French publishing office, editor of Back to Godhead magazine, and founder of Bala Books Children's Publishing Office. Currently, he serves as mediator for ISKCON Resolve. Yogeshwara has also earned his master's degree in religious studies at Hofstra University, where he taught Holocaust studies and Hinduism from 2003 to 2013. His devotional writings include Here Comes the Sun, The Spiritual and Musical Journey of George Harrison, Gita, Wisdom, An Introduction to India's Essential Yoga Text, and Swami in a Strange Land, an ISKCON authorized biography of Srila Prabhupada. He is also a documentary filmmaker whose films about Holocaust history are seen on PBS and Discovery, and his biographies of Holocaust survivors have sold more than 500,000 copies worldwide. What a great resume. And because he is an author of this book, Gita Wisdom, he is an excellent guest to talk about the Bhagavad Gita today. So thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Prabhu. Always wonderful to spend time with you.
Right. So a little history. I mean, we know each other, not so close over the years, but we know each other through our dealings within ISKCON, serving Srila Prabhupada and his movement and spreading the teachings of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Krishna and the Bhagavad Gita, etc., and Srimad Bhagavatam. But a little history maybe of a little relevance about your background that might lead us to and your understanding, our understanding of you and your realizations about the Bhagavad Gita based on your past, where you grew up, maybe your parents, what they were doing, your siblings, and what religious upbringing did you have, if any?
Mm-hmm.
So take us back a little bit prior to meeting Prabhupada and your introduction to the Gita.
Well, I'm 71. I was born in 1950. Very much a product of my generation. Went off to the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And in those days, we're talking 67, 68, students spent more time protesting the Vietnam War than they did attending classes. And I was rather disenchanted with the protest movement and thought, well, if I'm going to do this university thing, at least let me get some travel out of it. So I transferred to New York University in Paris and attended the Sorbonne studying literature. And I guess my introduction to Bhagavad Gita was while studying in Paris, attending classes in French given by Umapati at the American Center in the Latin Quarter on, I think it was on Sundays. And there was always fruit salad, prasadam. So in my head, I'm always connecting the Bhagavad Gita with fruit salad. There might have been some contact with the Gita previously at the University of Wisconsin. There were philosophy classes and so on, but it didn't make much of an impression. I think the English editions that were available in those days were rather dry and academic. So I think truly the first contact would have been when I started attending those classes in Paris.
Okay.
In 1969.
All right. Now, prior to that, growing up, let me get a little personal history background. Were you, what religion did your parents teach you, and what was your within the home prior to leaving the home for your university days?
Well, technically my parents were Jewish, but they were quite neutral when it came to religion. And in fact, I asked to be bar mitzvah when I was a lad because they had no plans for that. They were divorced also. My mom and dad were divorced when I was quite young, 2 years old or so. And
you lived with your mom or your dad?
lived with my mom, grew up with my mom. She was my best buddy. We kind of grew up together, really. She had me when she was 25. And
Okay.
we lived in a 2.5-room apartment in New York City.
With
and so
siblings?
we were together. No, I was an only child. My dad
Okay.
remarried. He had 3 children by his second marriage, including my brother Brian, who's a very well-known physicist.
Okay.
But like Brian's kids are not going to be bar or bat mitzvah because we had the same father, and he described himself as a religious atheist.
Your father did?
Yeah.
Okay.
He looked at the sadness of the world and was quite irate at the idea that there would be a deity, a supreme being, who could intervene if he so chose to do so and chose not to. And for him, that was a deal breaker.
So when they separated, when they divorced at 2.5, when you were 2.5, did your mother suggest that you go to synagogue, or
No, I was raised in ethical humanism. I went to the ethical culture schools, both junior and senior high school. In New York, the high school is called Fieldston. It's in the Bronx. Ethical culture is, I guess you might describe it as a non-theistic religion. It's a belief in humanity. It's a faith in the potential of human beings to achieve goodness and pursue their higher natures. Now, that was my, if you wanted to call it a religious background, that's about as close as it came.
in that time, during that time growing up within your mom's household, were you aware of God? Were you thinking, okay, is there a God? Is there not a God? Or were you just going along with the program with your schooling?
Yeah, no, I pursued girls, not God. I didn't do very well in either of those 2 callings, but there wasn't much discussion about it. My mom was a career woman in public relations and communications. And, in those days, we're talking mid to late 60s here, more attention was given to the energy around the peace movement, the anti-war movement. I remember attending concerts. There were, gigs in Greenwich Village back in those days, hearing Jimi Hendrix before he was known as Jimi Hendrix, Jose Feliciano, who else did I hear there? Bob Dylan. You could just kind of drop into the clubs in those days and hear the greats. So that was more the scene. It wasn't a religious orientation in any particular way.
Right. So not having a real foundation in religion or the study of God per se, how did it affect you when you took the classes at the Sorbonne with Umapati? Was there acceptance in that idea of a supreme being?
I honestly think that for many people, and I include myself here, not having a religious orientation is an advantage when it comes to contemplating pursuing a life as a devotee. Religion, as that term has been devolving over the last 100 years or more, is very often a negative. And I think that many people like me came as a tabula rasa, it's kind of a clean slate to Krishna consciousness. And so when we encountered Bhagavad Gita and Prabhupada's teachings, there wasn't any bias for or against. And for me, it was a kind of an awakening, an epiphany to the idea that there was anything at all practical in a life devoted to some supreme being. That just had not crossed my radar screen whatsoever until meeting Prabhupada's disciples, and then afterwards Prabhupada.
What about the Gita? What struck you about the Gita itself then was meaningful?
Well, before even getting an impression about the Gita, when on the Christmas holiday break from the Sorbonne in December of 1969, I went to London and walked into the Bury Place temple, the place that George Harrison had leased for the devotees. And that first impression was seeing God and his girlfriend on the altar, and he's black. I thought, this is hip. This is this is really good. This is cool, right? So coming out of the peace movement and finding a black God, and then he's got a girlfriend on top of it. Like, I'm in. This is good for me. There was a sense also in those days. You have to recall, changing lifestyles was not such a big deal back then. We were already outrageous. We were already wearing strange clothes and beads and painting our faces and experimenting with alternate kinds of paths. So moving into a temple as an experiment initially really wasn't that big a leap. Kind of what you did back then. Then over time, realizing, pardon the use of this expression, but I backed the right horse here. I picked the right group to identify with, because the more you learn, the more now getting into the Bhagavad Gita made sense, because all around you every day you're seeing it in action. See, I think the difficulty with religion per se, and I have to tell you, I don't consider myself a religious person to this day. I've never been religious. But the issue has always been the disconnect between theory and practice, between the ideals of faith cultures, wisdom traditions, and the lack of exemplars of those teachings. Now, meeting Prabhupada and his disciples, immediately you're struck with the fact these people, they're walking their talk. I think that's what George Harrison's initial impression was as well. That, boy, these people, this is the real deal here. So that impressed me. That was an early impression.
Right. So you moved into the temple on Berry Street at that time?
December 26th, about 2:00 in the afternoon, 1969. I remember the time because they were serving lunch prashad. And so my first image was walking down the stairs of that lovely little handcrafted temple. Shyam Sundar did such a beautiful job building the altar and all. And here were all these young people sitting around having a vegetarian lunch. Yamuna was there, ladling out the vegetables and the rice and all. And I'm thinking, boy, this is nice. Now remember, I was an only child. I never had at that time brothers and sisters. After my father remarried, I had siblings. And here was kind of a ready-made family. So when you talk about someone coming to Krishna consciousness, what you have to specify. Something I've learned over the years is you can't generalize about why people come to Krishna consciousness. You have to specify. And some people come because they were disenchanted. Some people come because they were seeking for some higher truth. Some people seem to have stumbled into it.
And you're the stumbler?
I mean, I've always been a stumbler. But I think for me, it was more from a psychological perspective that
you had a built-in family.
This is a kind of family environment. Wonderful devotees, the people who had come from San Francisco. Marvelous. What beautiful people they were. I just said, whatever they're into, I'm going to stay because I like this company.
Got it. When did the teachings of the Gita, I'm sure that they had Gita class and that then you maybe became, I'm assuming, became more absorbed in the actual philosophy then, after you felt at home with these fellow members. That what was the significant thing about the Gita that maybe, I don't know if you studied the Torah or maybe in school a little bit about the Bible. What, if not at all, what about the Gita became significant after you did some studies of the Gita itself, Bhagavad Gita as it is?
It's a good question. You're asking how did the Gita impress itself upon me?
Yes.
And I think the answer is over time. There was no immediate epiphany about the teachings of the Gita. I think it was, it's like if you go to a museum and you look at a painting when you're young, say Picasso's Guernica or Monet's Water Lilies or whatever. You have an impression when you're young, and then as you grow, as you live life, as you mature, your appreciation for a work of art deepens. So the same work of art seen 20 years later can have a vastly different significance because you've changed, your life has changed.
Mm-hmm.
I think the same is true with the Bhagavad Gita. You have an initial impression of the Gita, and that's fine, that's wonderful. But as you continue and live life, the significance of what Krishna has provided here becomes much more palpable, much more real. I'll give you an example. When I first joined the temple, for me, karma and material attachments. Look at there. Material attachments meant what? Basically, sex, drugs, food. That was pretty much it. And rock and roll. I couldn't get rock and roll music out of my head. So that was it. That's what attachment meant. I can understand now that karma, the things that bind us to this world, can be anything. It can be the pursuit of knowledge. It can be art and literature. Anything that's done with an aim toward self-aggrandizement, toward an enhancement of our life in this environment, is karmically loaded. But I didn't know that then. Then it was a rather simple formula. This is right, this is wrong, this is good, this is bad. If I've understood anything over the years, it's that Bhagavad Gita does not traffic in good and bad. Bhagavad Gita seeks to deepen our understanding of our life, of the world around us, of our relationships with others, and equip us with tools for better managing the challenges that come our way. So it's gradual, it's over time.
So it sounds like you saw it as really a non-sectarian book of teachings, practical lessons, perhaps. This is what I'm getting from what you're saying there, that you can advance in within your own inner nature and your own consciousness by these particular teachings that are in the Gita.
It's helpful hearing you phrase that because it's a wording that I wouldn't have chosen myself. I think to describe my relationship with Bhagavad Gita, it would be to say, first and foremost, always bearing in mind that it is about two people, Krishna and Arjuna, dear, dear friends from childhood, related by marriage. Arjuna was married to Krishna's sister. And that there was a love relationship there that allowed this transmission of teachings to take place. I mean, that's there in 18th chapter. Krishna comes right out and says it. I'm teaching you these things because I love you, because you're my dear friend. And that always impressed me profoundly, the idea that enlightenment, come to that highest stage of yogic achievement, is a matter of the heart. It's a matter of of caring, of wanting to help, of compassion. Boy, that made a lot of sense to me. Otherwise, if you just take the Gita as, you know, you only have, there's two options here. Either the Gita is a myth, you know, the whole world of Krishna is Hindu mythology. And then what is the Bhagavad Gita? Well, it's a vehicle for putting good teachings out into the world. And you don't have to worry about what's the relationship between Krishna and Arjuna, what is the dramatic structure of the text, it doesn't matter. It's just a vehicle, a convenient vehicle for putting good teachings out into society and maintaining the status quo or whatever. On the other hand, if you accept that these are real people, you know, Krishna is a real person, Arjuna is a real person, then we're obliged to approach the Gita with a very, very different perspective. One of, from our own experience of what it's like to interact with people, why are they speaking in this way? Why are they talking about this right now? And the way you read the verses is vastly different. If you accept that Krishna and Arjuna are real people and they love each other and they're having this discussion from that level of trust and intimacy, the Gita opens wide and it becomes something very, very different from the way it's studied in a classroom.
That's a good explanation. How did it, over the years then, studying it, obviously in your perspective, seeing that they are real people, accepting that fact and within that realm of the understanding of the Gita, Krishna actually instructing Arjuna as a friend to come to his senses and to do his duty and not be bewildered by family attachments, etc. But personally, then over the years, how has that teachings of the Gita been a practical, positive, I'm assuming a positive aspect, a positive book in your life? Have you been able to say, okay, well, this has helped me in this regard, and, you know, peace of mind, happiness, what has developed for you internally by the Gita?
I'm going to give you an answer that you might not have been anticipating. I would say the Gita has given me more challenges and sometimes confusion, sometimes rude awakening to myself and my own behavior and the way I live my life than moments of happiness and you know, good cheer. The Gita is a wake-up call. And if you allow yourself to embrace it as meant as a gesture of love, again, it comes back to that. If you understand Gita to be this gift, then it becomes almost like talk therapy. It's, there's this going deeper inside our nature, our behavior, the way we are in the world, in a way that is, I mean, I've consulted with psychiatrists and therapists over the years. I mean, the first thing I did when I left 13 years of temple life was to find a psychiatrist. It's like, what was I thinking? So, so I can tell you from experience, having done some studies in this area, the Gita is an ideal study in human psychology, deeply penetrating study in why we behave the way we do. And sometimes what you come up with is tough. You know, you're really obligated to confront the kind of excuses you make for yourself or being in a particular way. It challenges you to go beyond what you think your limits are. I mean, there are just so many penetrating dimensions of that text that it's a daily companion. I don't think I ever get bored reading a verse. I can read a verse 100 times, and every time there's something new coming out of it for me.
Interesting. What, I don't know whether you want to delve into this, but it comes to mind, curious thought as to, after being a devotee in the temple, etc., full time, I assume, for 13 years, what impelled you to seek out a psychiatrist or a psychologist? What was that
Oh,
internal thing that said, I need some help?
well, I first of all, I think it's common sense. I mean, this is Kali Yuga after all. Nobody has a pretty story to tell. And very often the things that determine our behavior, the things that set our values, the things that impede us from getting where we want to go, are events that happen quite early in life. I feel qualified to talk about this because these are things I've discussed with Prabhupada.
Okay.
I'm fortunate in that way. I spent a lot of time with him, and for whatever reason, I was rather brazen in questions that I asked him and things that we discussed one-on-one. And what a great privilege that was for me. And those memories have sustained me over the years. I mean, I've been a devotee now for 53 years or whatever. So more than a half century. And very often it's those discussions that I had with him that have kept me spiritually alive.
So
And,
what conversation did you?
well, yeah, let's talk about what we're discussing here, therapy. I asked him one time, what do you think of therapy? What do you think of psychiatry and psychology and counseling? He said, well, I used it for one of my children. He said, I had a son who came back from college, and he tapped his forehead like this. He said he wasn't right in the head. And he said in those days, the hospital in Calcutta had two wings. There was a British wing and a Hindu wing. And he said, I spent a lot more money to send my son to see a therapist in the British wing. I asked him, I said, that I had no idea that was even something that you would have considered doing. Did it work? Did you find it effective? He said, yes, for some time. My son got better. He was more his old self, his normal self. But then one day he said he left home and I never saw him again. So he said, I have qualified appreciation for therapy, but he did not condemn it by any stretch. I mean, he really thought that, it's like a dentist. You don't condemn dentistry because going to the dentist, you don't come out self-realized. I mean, you go to the dentist to get your cavity filled. So, there are mental challenges just as there are physical challenges, and there's no shame or
no stigma.
blemish. Right. You're not diminished by going to find help when you need it.
Right. Good.
So that's an example.
Okay. Let's get right down to the Gita itself. If you were to introduce the Gita to a new person, is there one verse or two that stick out as significant that might attract someone to want to delve further themselves into the Gita itself that is significant in your mind, for you personally?
Well, again, hoping to practice what I preach, I think rather than generalizing, you have to get very specific here. And if you're talking to someone who really has absolutely no background in the subject matter of consciousness and the difference between consciousness and matter and so on, you'd probably want to start with second chapter. You could go to 213, for example, Dehinosmin Yata Dehe. That's an image that almost anyone could be able to grasp. That you go from being a baby to being a child, and then to a young person, and then to an adult, and then to an old person. And you remember all these stages of your life. There's a continuity of awareness, of consciousness, despite the physical change. So death is yet one more change. Where does that consciousness go? So that's a very good starting point for someone who doesn't have much background. I think if you were talking to someone who had some exposure to Bhagavad Gita, you might want to go deeper, dig deeper inside some of the verses. For example, I'll give you an example. This is from teaching many years in yoga studios, where
Okay, good.
where the people attending think they understand the Bhagavad Gita. They think they know the Gita, but they don't.
Okay, yeah.
And
And you throw them a curveball. Go ahead.
Yes, exactly. Get them to think, but gee, there's something more here. Look at, let's say, 5:18, right? Vidya Vinaya Sampane Brahmani Gavihas. A pundit, a wise person, sees on an equal level, a cow, a Brahmin, a wise person, an elephant, a dog, and a dog eater. All right, now, why did Krishna choose those two? There's millions of species, millions of examples he could have chosen. Why dog and dog eater? That was obviously intentional. So to my way of thinking, what he's telling Arjuna, and again, this is for application in a yoga studio, don't get so proud of yourself because you're a vegetarian. The real spiritual principle is seeing the equality of all beings and offering honor and respect, no matter what a person's situation or background may be. That's your spiritual progress. Prabhupada used to say pigeons are vegetarian, but they're not particularly spiritually evolved. So you can, get inside it, with someone. You can go deeper inside a specific verse if someone's ready for that.
Did you saw some eyebrows go up in the yoga studio when
Eyebrows.
you mentioned some?
Whenever we got around to the theistic side, I'll never forget one class. This guy raised this. I'm starting to talk about Krishna and Bhakti and so on.
Uh-huh.
His hand goes up, and I'm quoting here, dude. I'm just here for the stretch. This is really beginning to sound too much like religion. And he left, and I never saw him again. So, you never know. Yeah. But I think that's the dividing line right there when you're teaching Bhagavad Gita. If you're talking about karma and yoga and this and that, no problem. People are down with all that. As soon as you start talking about bhakti as the ultimate purpose of the Gita's teachings, that's when the room divides in half. They're the people who are willing to consider the notion that there's some higher force in the universe and that we have a relationship with that higher force. And there are others who are just not ready to discuss that. So again, you have to specify, you have to be prepared to take the temperature in the room and decide then where to go.
You have to know your audience then.
Oh, yeah. Remaining sensitive to the notion that not too long ago, that was you sitting there.
Mm-hmm.
Like in my case, if someone had started talking to me about God and love of God, and I was like, bye-bye. But it was fun. London in those days, 69, 70, it was just a blast. I mean, you got to remember, we were recording with George Harrison at Apple Studios. What possible reason would I have for not staying? Yeah, count me in. It's so, the equivalent today may be that when people think about religion, they think about something that's been so misused, the scandals of the church and child abuse and misappropriation of funds and dogma and top-down, control of. It's not a pretty picture. So you do need to be careful when you talk about Krishna consciousness to not inadvertently trigger those associations in people's minds.
Right. You brought up George Harrison. From the time that you spent with him, were there discussions beyond putting the album together where you discuss philosophy, or that he would then
all the time. He was
discuss
wonderful.
putting those ideas of the Gita perhaps
Yeah,
into verses, into song?
sure. All the time, all the time. George was a good example of a super intelligent person, open to ideas that may not have been to his liking initially. I mean, George grew up in a family where he would see the priests in Liverpool going from church to the pub across the street.
Mhm.
And just going around making collections of money, in poor districts of the city. So he was not particularly favorable to the institutional side of religion. When he met devotees, I mean, he was primed. You got to remember that also. He had been to Maharishi's ashram in Rishikesh just, I think, about 2 months before he met Sham Sundar initially, and then the others. And had some intuition that there's something here. There's some meaning. When you live life like those lads did, there wasn't an experience in the world they hadn't already had. And George was looking for something more. He once described his life as climbing to the top of a mountain and then peering over and seeing how much more there was on the other side. I remember being in, was it EMI? One of the recording studios, it might have been Abbey Road, one of the recording studios for the Radhakrishna Temple album. I was sitting in the sound booth with him and said, "How's your spiritual life?" I mean, we didn't know each other very well. I mean, I wasn't a buddy the way Sham Sundar was, but he took it very seriously. He said, "Well," he says, "I'm having a problem with the whole guru thing." Why do you think that is? And again, he thought long and hard, and he says, "It must be me karma." He didn't have a more of an answer than that at the time. I think there was, in his mind, an issue around, can you really surrender yourself to a human being?
Right.
After all, we're all souls in this world, And so as much as the affection was there between him and Prabhupada, he had also had some rather unpleasant experiences with other gurus. So he admitted that, he was right up front to talk about these things. That was his credit, that he had that capacity to address tough issues in public.
Well, I guess that really begs the question, did you speak words of wisdom to him, or did you let it be?
I probably spouted off some, highfalutin, pontificating half-truth that I had no idea what I was saying. I mean, I remember I was 19 years old at the time.
Okay.
We don't always make our most eloquent statements when we're 19.
Right. All right, good. Well, I just want to kind of wrap it up a little bit with a question that I ask everyone that's part of this podcast. The Bhagavad Gita that you studied as it is, were you able over time, obviously maybe not before you met the devotees and studied the Bhagavad Gita as it is with him and with Prabhupada, a difference between other authors, other teachers of the Bhagavad Gita who wrote different types of Bhagavad Gitas? In other words, why should one sincerely, if one is interested in studying a Bhagavad Gita, why the Bhagavad Gita as it is as opposed to others?
Well, that kind of, elevates the idea of a loaded question to a new height there. Let me put it this way. I think everyone has his or her particular level of realization about the Gita's teachings. And obviously you want to be careful about not embracing fallacious statements or commentaries. But there's a lot to be gained reading different editions of the Gita. There are environmental editions of the Bhagavad Gita. There's an edition of the Bhagavad Gita that there are several that focus on social action. You know, the karma yoga angle on Bhagavad Gita. There's a Bhagavad Gita for business people, how to apply the teachings of the Gita in the workplace. And all of these different editions have a particular contribution to make. Obviously, I'm biased here. None of them has the spiritual depth of Prabhupada's edition, because the authors didn't love Krishna the way Prabhupada loved Krishna.
Mm-hmm.
But I wouldn't be dismissive of these other works. I think our job, in fact, as devotees in the 21st century, is to go inside the experiences of our life, the opportunities that come our way, not just in different editions of the Gita, but in everything really, and find the good. I think when we were younger, when the movement was younger, there was this holier than thou kind of attitude.
Yes.
And we've matured past that now, or at least we should have.
Good. That's great. What a great realization. A very unique understanding of the Gita and the teachings, and a great perspective. So I appreciate that. Great. And I want to thank you again for joining me and on this podcast and giving us your realizations about the Gita and so many other topics that we've touched upon. And I thank you. You're very kind to join me.
Well, you know, Siddhanta, over the many years that we've known each other, I've always admired your dedication to exploring the lives of God brothers and God sisters and evoking from them gifts that through your channels you've been passing along to the wider public. And that's a tremendously important and wonderful service that you're doing. So I thank you for including me in what you do.
Well, the feeling is mutual. And if I might say, without blowing smoke up your dhoti, I think you're one of the best authors within ISKCON, if not a wider world of authors. So, you know, you've been blessed, and thank you for sharing your abilities. Truly.
Thank you for your kind words.
Okay. Have a great day. Hare Krishna.
Hare Bol.